Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. The crisis in Sudan has taken another devastating turn. A genocidal paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces has attacked a sprawling refugee camp in Darfur. Nearly 400,000 people have fled the camp and are now traversing the desert in search of safety. Meanwhile, the RSF is mounting an offensive on the last major city in Darfur not under its control. This escalation comes as the world rather quietly marked the second anniversary of Sudan's civil war. In April 2022, rival generals vied for control of the country, plunging it into chaos. 2 years on, Sudan has become the world's largest humanitarian crisis, with over 12 million people forcibly displaced from their homes. One of them is Dalia Abdel Moneim. She fled her home in Khartoum shortly after the war began and is now living in Cairo. She joins me for a conversation about the unfolding catastrophe in Sudan. We begin by discussing the dire situation in Darfur and move into a wide-ranging conversation about the broader dynamics of the conflict, including the possibility that Sudan is headed towards a de facto partition, with the RSF controlling Darfur in the west and the Sudanese armed forces holding Khartoum and much of the south of the east. We recorded our conversation live using Substack. If you'd like to join one of these live conversations as it's happening, please become a subscriber at globaldispatches.org. Thank you. And now here is my conversation with Dalia Abdel Moneim.
Hi, I'm Dalia Abdel Moneim. I'm a Sudanese activist in civil society. I am one of the many millions who had to flee my home country when war broke out, and I'm currently based in Cairo, and I'm more than happy to join today's episode.
So, Dalia, just to give maybe some context from where you're coming from. So, you were in Khartoum when the war broke out now 2 years ago. We're speaking near the anniversary of the outbreak of the conflict. Can you just explain the process, like how you made it out and why you felt you needed to leave?
I initially had no intention of leaving. I honestly believed and thought it will be over in a few days. We just have to ride out the storm, so to speak. But our house was hit by a missile, and that rendered our house, our home, as no longer safe. And when I say our, it was me and my immediate family. We were around 5, 6 people in the house. And so we had to find safety. And so we moved to the outskirts of Khartoum within day 5 of the war. And it took us around 2 days to reach the eastern region of Sudan, Port Sudan, which is now the de facto capital. And by the first week of May, we had managed, very luckily, to find a way to leave Sudan, simply because the the minute the foreign nationals were being told to evacuate by their embassies, that's when we knew we all had to leave. Those who could and can should leave.
Hmm.
And like I said, I'm one of the very fortunate ones that we were able to do that. We were able, to find a bus to take us out of Khartoum to Port Sudan. We managed to find seats for myself and my elderly mother on a flight that took us to Cairo, which is where I'm currently based. And it's been 2 years of absolute turmoil, and it hangs heavy on our hearts simply because there's also the guilt factor that we got out, we're safe, but millions of others didn't, and they're still stuck in this, never ending cycle of violence, of war and conflict. And so yeah, I now work in civic society in advocacy for Sudan, and that was never my background. Actually, I had my own small baking business. I was
Hmm.
making cakes and cookies. That was my thing. But I switched, I pivoted simply because I realized Sudanese voices are very hard, very rare. We're a small circle. And we need to continuously talk about Sudan, advocate for Sudan, and just post about Sudan because no one else will.
Well, thank you for sharing that story because, we in the media often refer to Sudan as the world's largest humanitarian crisis, and we, cite the number 12 million people displaced. But, you know, each one of those displacements is an individual story. So thank you for sharing yours. So, we are speaking near the anniversary of the outbreak of Sudan's civil war. And just to give listeners and viewers some really brief background, the conflict erupted essentially as the consequence of a failed democratic transition that resulted in two rival generals vying for power over the country: the head of the Sudanese armed forces, General Burhan, on one side, and the head of the paramilitary rapid support forces, Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hemedti. The conflict has evolved in ways that you and I are sure to discuss over the course of the last 2 years. But the way things stand now is that there's fighting in many places, but for the most part, the Sudanese armed forces, led by General Burhan, control much of Khartoum and much of the east of the country, whereas the RSF controls much, but not all, of the west of the country in Darfur. And that's where I wanted to pick up our conversation today, because over the last few days, even, there has been a profound escalation of the conflict and of the humanitarian crisis in Darfur. Can you just briefly explain and to viewers what has been happening around Zamzam, a big refugee camp? What is Zamzam? And just kind of explain the dynamics there, because this is one of the most urgent situations right now in Sudan.
I'll start off by saying the people of Darfur are the most vulnerable group of people in Sudan, simply because they already went through a war back in 2003, the war in Darfur. And a lot of those people who were displaced, who were made refugees and so on, were housed in these camps, Zamzam being one of them. And now what's happening, and Zamzam is in the northern part. Darfur is a huge region. It's divided into four: north, west, and east, and so on. Al Fashir is the capital of North Darfur, which is where Zamzam camp is. And Al Fashir city is one of the few remaining cities and areas in Darfur not under the control of the RSF. Now, the RSF have been renamed, but their origins are the Janjaweed,
Mhm.
the perpetrators of the genocide in Darfur back in 2003. And so they have a new name and they have a new look, and they're a militia. They're a militia for hire because they also fought for the UAE and Saudi in Yemen, and they also fought in Libya. So this is what the RSF is. What's happening now is that Zamzam camp was housing nearly 1 million displaced Darfurians. Until yesterday, more than 400,000 had fled to safety. In a matter of 48 hours, the RSF has massacred more than 400 civilians. Like I said, these civilians are the most vulnerable. They have nothing. They are living in a camp that is reliant on aid and humanitarian assistance from aid agencies and from local volunteer groups. And so I'm reading reports, and it is makes for the most harrowing of reads because there's also ethnic divisions in Darfur based on your tribe.
Mhm.
So you have tribes that are of African background and you have tribes that are of Arab background. They're all Muslim, but their ethnicity is is something that is used as a weapon against them. And the RSF is mainly made up of the Arab groups. And so they are basically massacring and committing atrocities against the majority of the African civilians, African background civilians. End of the
And
day,
it's
they
just
are
worth
also.
Yeah, I mean, it's just worth maybe pointing out that many experts in mass atrocity and genocide have concluded that what the RSF is doing against ethnic Africans, the Muslim in particular, amounts to genocide. This was a declaration of determination that the outgoing Biden administration made. So
Yes.
this is a conflict just mired in ethnic atrocity. And I just want to go back to something you said a moment ago, because you said about 1 million people in these camps around El Fasher, the largest city in North Darfur, and the one area still under the control of the Sudanese armed forces. The RSF has, over the last several days, attacked this camp. And you said something like 400,000 people are now on the move. That
Yes.
is just in the context of displacement crises. That is an astronomical number. Like,
It is.
where are these people going?
Across the desert to wherever they can find safety. I mean, already 9 aid workers who were part of the relief aid organization were killed by the RSF, including the head of the one of the few health clinics that were operating. So they are targeting the most vulnerable. They are targeting those who are providing help and assistance to the most vulnerable. And they're doing it with the absolute sense of they can get away with it because accountability and justice has never been brought to the forefront. And when I say accountability and justice, because what happened back in 2003 was never, those who perpetrated all those violent acts were never brought to justice. And so this is a repeat. It's a repeat of what happened 20 years ago. And it kills me because the people of Darfur don't deserve this. They are, end of the day, they are civilians, they are farmers, they are people who just want to live in safety. And we just had the conference in London, and the final statement that was released at the end of the conference did not even mention Al Fashir, did not even mention what was happening to these civilians. These are civilians. These are not armed combatants. These are not armed militias. They are just women, men, elderly, and children. There was a report, which I don't know if it was confirmed, but that the RSF was massacring children and then was going to the mothers and telling them, we are now your men, you are ours.
Mhm.
As in, so there's ethnic cleansing because
Yeah.
they are targeting this, a certain this, they are targeting the men and the boys. And there's genocide because a certain groups are being targeted simply based on their race and for them to be completely eradicated. And there's no outcry. I mean, honestly, I'm sick and tired of reading all these statements by, we condemn what is happening. Your condemnation does nothing.
Hmm.
I can condemn till the moon turns blue, but what will my condemnation need? I need more action. I need penalties. I need there to be, to implement the arms embargo that is has been in place in Darfur since for more than 20 years. Implemented, penalize those the countries that continuously violate this embargo and continuously supply both armies with weapons which are used against the civilians. Like, end of the day, this is a war on civilians. This is something that
Yeah.
people need to understand. It's
So
not a
I
war over territory, it's a war on civilians.
so I actually do want to get back later in this conversation to policy options that exist to reduce the levels of violence, if not try to impose or get to some sort of ceasefire. But I do want to ask you before that about a significant recent political development as well. In tandem with the RSF's attacks on this massive refugee camp and its attempt to capture the last remaining city in North Darfur, not under its control, El Fasher. The RSF has, declared itself to be like some sort of government as well. Can you just like explain what happened there? Like what was that declaration, and what kind of broader diplomatic or international significance do you see it having?
Well, what happened was that there was the civilian bloc made of political parties and armed groups and civic society groups that was under the banner, the umbrella of Taqaddum, which means forward. That group, that entity split into two. Those who decided to join the RSF's parallel government, Now, this government is supposedly they promise that they will deliver a civilian-led government to rule over the areas that they will be under control. While they've declared this government, the RSF forces are massacring civilians. So where is the protection of civilians that you've been promising for so long? And in regards to the international impact, I'm waiting to see if any country will recognize this parallel government. So far, if I'm not mistaken, several Arab countries, the United States, and several other Western nations have said that we will not recognize it. So how will they operate?
Yeah.
End of the day, the RSF is a very rich army military simply because of the business operations of the Dagalo family and the fact that they control some of the largest gold mines in Sudan. And the smuggling of gold has never stopped from day one since the war broke out and even before then. And that is how they're financing this war,
Mm.
by smuggling gold out of Sudan into countries such as the United Arab Emirates, which is also a supporter of the RSF.
Mm.
And then you have SAF on the other side that is supported by the likes of Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Qatar. So it's a mix. And but even the United Arab Emirates has not said anything regarding this new parallel government, and
Hmm.
they cannot come out and say that we support them or recognize them, because that will not,
Yeah.
bode well for them. But I don't see. I think they it may give them the RSF is seeking legitimacy, and this government maybe they believe they will get them that legitimacy,
Hmm.
but how? So unless they win this war outright, or unless by de facto the western region of Sudan is partitioned, and then if they control, or if they gain control of Al Fashir, they will have control over the whole western region of Sudan.
Yeah.
Now that's the size of Spain. The whole
Well,
Darfur region is the size of Spain. So you talk about the size of a whole of a European country, and that is one scenario that we have to think about, that
that's
could
actually
possibly happen.
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to ask you. Over recent weeks and months, you have this ongoing battle in El Fasher. If El Fasher falls to the RSF, you will essentially have a geographic divide between territory controlled by the RSF and territory controlled by the Sudanese armed forces. And that kind of raises the prospect of a potential partition of Sudan, more or less along these battle lines. Again, with like the Sudanese armed forces controlling Khartoum and Port Sudan and parts of the south, with the RSF controlling the west in Darfur. To what extent is that scenario, possible, imaginable, and what like impact might it have?
There's one important factor that we all need to consider. SAF has
And when you say
alliances.
SAF, you're referring to the Sudanese armed
The Sudanese
forces.
armed forces,
Yeah.
they have alliances with other Darfuri armies and militias. They're called the joint forces. Now, these joint forces, will they be okay with the fact that, Al Fashir can fall and be under the control of the RSF? No, because this is their territory as well. So what's happening right now is there has been a call made for more fighters to join SAF and its joint forces to fight and save Al Fashir from the RSF. Now that will be the next battle. But if Al Fashir falls, then by de facto there will be a partitioning of the country. And it also goes back to, will SAF be willing to fight for Darfur? Or
Hmm.
will they be happy to have in their own control central, eastern, northern Sudan? Will they be happy with that? Or will they, have the momentum that they've gained over the past few months and push on and fight and try to defeat the RSF in the Western region? But that goes back to if SAF plans to do that or not.
Yeah. Well, can I ask you a question? As someone, and I'm presuming here that your top concern is the safety of Sudanese people from harm, the ability to get aid in, and the ability of like a restoration of some sort of reduction of violence. Is a potential partition scenario one which, potentially over the medium term might result in a reduction of violence and a relative increase of individual safety for Sudanese. You're shaking your head no.
No, no, absolutely not. Simply because I know the RSF will, move into this absolute stream of violence and just committing atrocities left, right, and center. I have little faith in the RSF actually protecting civilians in any shape or form. And at the same time, we're getting all these reports of, even in the areas that have been recaptured by SAF, there has been retaliation against those they deem as, collaborators with the RSF, or, those who they deem as someone who is more pro RSF and not SAF. So the fallout is will always be on the civilians. So protection of civilians, us in civil society have been bringing it up and, talking about it, but it fell on deaf ears. No one wanted to hear about how they can, what measures needed to be put in place to ensure the protection of civilians. We couldn't even get people to agree on the creation of safe zones. And when we say safe zones, we're talking about hospitals not being hit, marketplaces not being hit, schools, churches, mosques. No one wanted to hear that. So the protection of civilians is seen as so low on the hierarchy. The loss of lives is just collateral damage to both armies. That's something that needs to be, said out. People need to understand that people are collateral damage. End of the day, this is a game that's come down to power. Who is the stronger and who will last the longest? And yeah, I mean,
Yeah. So earlier you referred to a London conference that just concluded this week, focused on Sudan, that sought to raise some money for the humanitarian response, and sought to inject some amount of political momentum around international diplomacy around a peace deal or some sort of reduction of violence. It delivered very little on both fronts. Can you just explain what happened at that conference? And more broadly, what can the international community do now to try to reduce violence? I mean, you alluded earlier to the fact that while this is a civil war, there are external backers of both sides, the UAE backing the RSF primarily, Egypt backing the Sudanese armed forces. Um, like how can international pressure potentially be brought to try to reduce levels of violence at this point?
very little, simply because there's no incentive for any, international community member to bring pressure, to apply pressure on either the UAE or Egypt or Saudi or Iran even. There is no incentive, simply because their interests, their own interests as countries, supersede the interest of protecting civilians or ending this war. Don't forget, wars are very lucrative businesses. For some certain groups, it's a major money making business. So when you have countries like Iran and China and Turkey and Belarusia and Russia and Egypt providing, and the UAE providing and selling arms, it's a big business for them. So it's not in their interest to end this war. And at the same time, I remember last September when there was a General Assembly, meeting in the United Nations, and Mohammed bin Zayed, the UAE ruler, met with President Biden. You know, it was a golden opportunity to push the UAE in regards to their support for the RSF. The communique that was The statement that was released was basically pushing forward better relations, better security relations, better economic interest relations between the United States and the UAE. So no pressure was applied on the UAE. Same
Yeah.
thing with this conference. I understand that they did not invite neither the RSF nor SAF, but they couldn't even, at the London conference, there was disagreement between Egypt, Saudi, and the UAE on what the final statement would say. Egypt and Saudi were pushing for basically the protection of state institutions, i.e., the army. The UAE was against this. They were saying
Mhm.
no. civilian institutions, which means they're pushing for the civilian aspect. Who are the civilians? The new parallel government that was announced
Mm.
in cahoots with the RSF. So if you can't even agree on a statement
Yeah.
and no pressure is being applied to you by other actors in the international arena,
Yeah.
it's just,
Yeah. I mean, like the key international players here, the UAE and Egypt primarily, are both countries with deep security relationships with the United States. The Biden administration, like tried a little bit, but was distracted, in my view, all the way by other things, by the conflict in Gaza in particular, where they needed both UAE and Egypt's support. And so, though, in my view, they never pressed too hard on Sudan. It was never much of a priority. I can only imagine that kind of has dropped even further in the context of the Trump administration, which I can't imagine is doing much of anything right now. I mean, we're in the process of freezing foreign aid and closing down our embassies around the world, let alone engaging in trying to resolve a conflict like this. And that kind of brings me back to something that I know a friend of yours, Khulud Khair, told me in the first interview I did about the Sudanese armed conflict, civil war a few years ago, that Sudan is just dying from neglect. And it seems that neglect has become even more pronounced as this conflict drags on.
I mean, I understand your point about Biden being, looking into Gaza, but Gaza occurred in October. Our war broke out in April.
Yeah,
So there's a month in between when nothing was being done. Even the Jeddah talks were just half-hearted talks.
yeah,
Um, Unfortunately, I completely agree with Khulud in that sense. It's neglected, but at the same time, it's neglected. That neglect will come at a very hefty cost geopolitically. If you look at Sudan, where we're located, access to the Red Sea, access into Central and Western Africa, the Nile, runs through Sudan. We border 7 countries. The fallout of this war will be huge, and by that, and that will happen simply because if you look at our neighbors, what's happening in South Sudan, what's happening in Ethiopia, what's happening in Chad, they're vulnerable states. They're not stable states at this moment in time, and the fallout from this war, because what happens, people cross over into borders, and then, well, let's say war erupts in South Sudan. Where will the people in South Sudan go to Sudan, which is, and so Sudan is being neglected, absolutely, but that neglect will come at a very heavy cost. And we've been saying this, you, in a way, like they say, you need to nip it in the bud from the beginning. It needs to be nipped in, and it wasn't. It was allowed to continue, and I can't envision any chance of any negotiations or peace talks being held, or actually being applicable at this moment in time, because both armies are fully intent on crushing the other one. And like I said, there's no outside actor really wants to step in and do something about it. Like I said, we get a lot of nice words, we get a lot of nice statements, but no action. Word talk is cheap. I can say a lot of things, but what are you doing about it? How are you making sure
mhm,
that the UAE does not supply arms to the RSF? How are you ensuring that the Sudanese army does not, continue with its bombings of civilian areas, and killing hundreds of people? How can you guarantee that civilians are protected by both sides? How can, if the army itself is holding up aid deliveries, through bureaucratic and technical obstacles, no one is applying pressure
yeah.
to either side, and they're getting away with it. End of the day, this is what's happening.
Well, Dahlia, thank you so much for your time. I sincerely hope that someday soon you'll be able to go back to Khartoum and reopen your bakery. But thank
So
you.
thank
Thank
you,
you
thank you
so
so
much.
much.
I appreciate it. And thank you
Thank you.
everyone for joining this live stream.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please go to globaldispatches.org to sign up for our newsletter. And while you're there, please do take the opportunity to get a paid subscription to support our work.
You'll get full access to our sister podcast about the United Nations called To Save Us from Hell, as well as full access to all of my writing and the writing of our guests on globaldispatches.org. Thank you.